Hello and welcome to today's PRMA Consulting webinar. I'm Claire Jones, Associate Director with PRMA. Before I hand over to David, I'm just going to run through how to participate in today's webinar. Then David will talk for about 25 minutes, after which he'll take questions. Please submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the dash panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Click to expand the questions area and then type your question in the box at the bottom. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David Sykes, Founding Partner of PRMA Consulting.
Thanks, Claire. Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to take you through some of the emerging and current market access themes in oncology in the EU. A lot of this experience is based on our work at PRMA, specialising in market access in oncology. And as you can see from this slide, we've worked in over 20 tumour types, both solid and heme, over the last several years. The first slide just summarises a framework for some of the key trends in oncology market access in Europe as we see them. And we've separated these out into summary issues and then different concepts. So firstly, I'll just go through the slide, and then the focus of today's talk will be on the concepts highlighted in the orange box. The first challenge is obviously around how we define and pay for value. The whole concept of value, price and affordability from an EU, but also from a US perspective, is becoming more pertinent almost on a daily basis. The concept of how we define innovation is obviously a hot topic as well, and also as we think about how manufacturers are trying to secure increased speed to market, but at the expense of significant challenges to payers. The regulatory environment is encouraging earlier approvals, but that comes with higher levels of uncertainty for payers as well. So we're going to talk about a number of the issues around surrogate endpoints, appropriate comparators, subgroups as well, in the context of being able to show differentiated value propositions to satisfy payers. Other big issues are around the definition of the target patient population. We'll cover that. We'll cover some of that within the context of subgroups, but the whole perspective and quantification of the eligible patient population and price volume is a key driver of contractual strategies, including risk shares and patient access schemes. So that highlights some of the key issues as we see them from an oncology perspective in Europe. The areas we're going to focus on today are surrogate endpoints, appropriate comparators, subgroups, quality of survival, and combinations. So the first theme that we're going to cover is related to surrogate endpoints, and obviously that's a significant challenge. We're all used to OS being recognised as the gold standard for establishing clinical benefit, and that's what payers are expecting in terms of evidence packages. However, we have a situation where regulators are encouraging early approval based on limited data and surrogate intermediate endpoints. This obviously increases uncertainty for payers. So the whole concept of breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, is mainly predicated on data around surrogates or intermediates. And obviously with the US being the primary commercial focus of these development programs, we're getting situations where development programs are being targeted at the US to expedite earlier approval, but with more limited data packages, and that's being significantly challenged from the European payers. We also understand, and the payers understand very well, that the relationships between intermediate endpoints such as PFS, ORR, CR, and overall survival varies considerably across and between tumour types as well. So we can't apply one relationship across different tumour types. And as agencies critically review this, they have different perspectives on surrogates as well, from some being very open to surrogates all the way through to the Germans where anything other than overall survival is not deemed to be patient relevant. So we have to be very cautious and think through how manufacturers can gain commercially relevant access using surrogate intermediate endpoints in the above context that we've just outlined. Now, this could be the content of a standalone webinar, so we're not going to go into the methodological requirements, but these images here capture the methodological guidances from agencies in France, Germany and the UK, and just highlight some of the issues on the next slide from a German IQWiC perspective of the level of technical detail that they go into and their expectations around the acceptability of a surrogate endpoint. I think it's really important to understand as well that what fits one agency may not fit the needs of another agency as well. So in the context of colorectal cancer, for example, there's evidence nice of accepted level 1 evidence about the correlation between PFS and OS, whereas in Germany this would not have been accepted by IQWiC as well. So it's important to recognise that there are different perspectives on this according to the different geography. So how do manufacturers reconcile this tension? Commercial organisations and commercial decisions are driving regulatory applications and seeking regulatory approvals as quickly as possible in as cheap as way as possible as well. We all know and we all live this on a day-to-day basis that doesn't necessarily help us when we come to requesting for commercially relevant prices and reimbursed patient populations in Europe. So how can we mitigate that tension? Well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand strategically that the methodological frameworks, hurdles and requirements in each market or payer archetype differ. So we need to consider those in the early stages of trial design. We also need to understand and recognize the relationship between surrogates and OS in the indication of population of interest. So you need to be understanding that work at the very beginning of a development program. And will the proposed trial program meet those evidentiary hurdles for surrogate endpoints? So there's a lot of foundational work that can be done to really help inform strategically whether you're going to be able to meet these evidence needs or whether you're not. And that obviously has implications then for the potential trade-off between reimbursement, price and access. A couple of other important points here to acknowledge relate to if you have a trial base that's using surrogate, it's really important to collect additional data post-primary endpoint on survival. I think it's a very different discussion going to HTA agencies with immature data, immature OS data versus going with no OS data at all. So it's really of critical importance to carry on the trial and collect that data as well. If you're going with a non-OS value proposition, it's absolutely critical to think about the value proposition much more broadly. So what is the role of AEs? What is the role of PROs? What is the natural history of this potential patient population? Those drivers of value become more important in the context of a surrogate endpoint and need to be dealt with appropriately at earlier stages. The next area we're going to focus on for a few minutes relates to subgroups. Now, everybody is familiar with subgroups, everybody's familiar with the concept and the tension on a manufacturer side between commercial, market access, HE groups who naturally gravitate to this particular vulnerability. As we see in Europe, all payers are increasingly using subgroups to dissect a product's value proposition. And this could be based on a number of different factors, including whether the natural history of a disease differs according to subgroup, whether there are effect modifiers, whether the clinical efficacy of a product is likely to differ according to subgroup, is the cost effectiveness different in that subgroup. And we're increasingly seeing more focus on more creative subgroups, including stage of disease, presence of visceral metastases, etc. Now, obviously, this potentially influences trial design and the potential choice of comparator as well. So the question strategically we need to pose is, how can manufacturers anticipate payer subgroups and minimize the impact on the value proposition and commercial opportunity? Now, we've seen multiple examples here of this issue. Almost every evaluation focuses on subgroups in some way, shape or form. The slide here highlights afatinib in non-small cell lung cancer, and you can see how the subgroups have been split out by IQWiC GBA, and also how the comparator has differed as well, and the assignation of additional benefit has changed according to that. We've got multiple other examples in Germany as well, including a recent assessment of Zidelig, which in CLL, and for a very small tumour type, 5 subgroups were identified. In France as well, we've seen examples with melanoma, where prior to the approval of Zelboraf, Yervoy was restricted to second-line patients without BRAF mutations as well. So that was quite a novel use of subgroups by the French agency. So how do we mitigate against these? How do we anticipate these issues around subgroups, and how do we try and blunt those as well? Well, first of all, again, I think it's being proactive and honest with cross-functional teams about the likelihood of regulators and probably more relevantly payers identifying subgroups. So able to anticipate those subgroups. Obviously, we can think through examples in that indication or relevant analogues that would give us a sense of how likely that is, but also thinking about how the landscape is emerging as well. So in terms of the emerging competitors, in which patient populations are they being tested, how is that likely to map through into subsequent subgroups as well. So we need to be very clear about how the competitive landscape and the current landscape changes or influences those issues around subgroups. We also need to be thinking about how we develop different value propositions for subgroups as well, and whether these subgroups have common comparators. We saw on the previous slide with afatinib where the comparators were different according to those different subgroups. So it's quite unlikely in a lot of situations that there will be a common comparator across multiple subgroups. So we understand there's a significant tension there between commercial and other functions within the organisation about trying to ensure reimbursement is in line with the regulatory label, but unfortunately the European reality is such that most agencies are really focused on trying to restrict those patient populations in terms of the numbers of eligible patients, or to try and beat up a particular subgroup in order to help them when it comes to pricing negotiations. So it's great to think about homogeneity of treatment effect. It's great to target reimbursement in line with EMA approval, but a starting assumption has to be subgroups. I think you need to be planning for those, you need to be anticipating those, and they need to be incorporated from a commercial perspective, but also from an evidence generation perspective as well. The subgroups and the comparators are obviously very interdependent, as is a lot of this information we're going through, but I wanted to just come back to the comparators. You know, the challenge we often have is it's often chosen, the comparator is often chosen to satisfy regulators, and it may likely be informed by US clinical practice. If there's differences within practices from the US to EU, that presents a challenge in terms of relevant and reimbursed comparators, and there are multiple examples around this. As we know as well from, you know, as we all know from a European perspective, they're not really too concerned about the regulatory choice of comparator. What they want to see is incremental benefit against a relevant and reimbursed standard of care in their country. And of course, this is a very, very difficult choice. It might often be chosen by the scientists as opposed to informed and enabled by the market access groups. So the issue becomes here, especially in oncology where the landscapes are moving so rapidly, how can manufacturers generate evidence that allows payers to evaluate their product versus a reimbursed and relevant standard of care? And again, there are multiple examples out there in Germany, in France, in the UK, in lots of other countries where the comparator has deemed to be inappropriate. We just highlight 3 examples here. Zidelig in CLL in Germany, where the trial comparator was against rituximab, and that was deemed to be an inappropriate comparator given it was unlicensed in this indication. And we've seen a situation with Halaven in its first indication in metastatic breast cancer, where the trial comparison was against physician's choice, and we saw significant pushback from both France and the UK about the relevance of the comparator and its respective weighting in that assessment of what was deemed to be relevant comparator or otherwise. Taflunar in melanoma is a good example of how things have moved very, very quickly. The original comparator in the assessment was deemed to be dacarbazine, but that moved to vemurafenib after the hearing procedure because that was recognized as the standard of care. So anticipating what the standard of care is at the beginning of the trial design program is one key part. Understanding how that changes over the course of the trial program and regulatory approval. You need to be flexible and proactive in understanding how that emerging landscape is going to influence your assessment at HTA. So, you know, how can we mitigate that? Well, you know, it'd be great for everybody to have a crystal ball. Unfortunately, you know, this is a real challenge in terms of effectively choosing the comparators. We can't get this right perfectly every time. We can do a lot of foundational work and thinking though and trade-offs to understand how we can try and de-risk some of this. So we need to be thinking about what's reimbursed and what's relevant in the key markets. We need to be understanding the current and emerging trial network to see where the landscape is likely to land at time of launch. We need to be thinking about indirect treatment comparisons strategically and not just tactically. So will an ITC dilute your value proposition? Will it be neutral, or will it be positive in terms of your value proposition? We need to be understanding the trade-off in terms of the comparator choice, price, and access around that as well. So the organizations who are making these decisions need to be very aware need to be very aware that the pricing opportunity and the value assessment is driven by the comparator choice. And as long as everybody's aware of those commercial trade-offs when the trial is developed, then that puts that conversation in a much clearer light. The next issue I want to address relates to quality of survival. We're in a situation where there's been lots of oncology launches over the last 3 or 4 years. The landscape has changed rapidly in a number of different tumour types, and physicians now have choice in a number of different tumour types. What payers are interested in, though, is not just the quantity of survival, they're interested in the quality of survival. And what do I mean by that? Well, what we've seen recently, and this has emerged very rapidly over the course of the last couple of years, is that adverse events and patient-reported outcomes, health-related quality of life, are key value drivers in oncology assessments. It's really important for agencies to have appropriate information on AEs and PROs in order so they can contextualize the survival benefit. It's not just the quantity they're interested in, it's the quality. Payers have a different informational requirement around AEs than do regulators. They're interested in the intensity, the duration, the management, and the patient relevance of AEs. And we've seen a rapid change in the relevance of PRO and symptom data as value drivers as well in oncology assessments, and we'll highlight this with a couple of examples on the next slide. We've seen with Xalkori in non-small cell lung cancer after the initial assessment and during the hearing procedure, additional information around symptoms and HEOR as well as additional clinical data was submitted, and the result was changed from no additional benefit proven to a hint of significant additional benefit versus chemo in a patient subgroup. We've seen a recent example with Stavaga in metastatic colorectal cancer, where because of the limited survival benefit, approximately 1.5 months, the payers in Germany felt that survival benefit could not be put into appropriate context in the absence of morbidity and HRQL data, and hence the benefit assessment was reduced to a hint of minor additional benefit. And on the AE side, we've seen examples with Jakavi myelofibrosis. You can read that last sentence there where the AE profile was not deemed significant enough to warrant a reduction in the perceived benefit to patients. These side effects were classified as controllable and treatable. Now, that's a very different mindset to how we report and analyze that data compared to how we think about this from a regulatory perspective. So, I think there's a couple of things we can think about here in terms of how we better understand the concept of quality of survival and how we mitigate against those challenges. I think it's important to understand now that we firstly need to identify the concepts that are relevant to patients with the indication. I think it's also critical to understand that assessment of a PRO claim needs to be broader than just that label perspective. Certainly payers in Europe are much less concerned about whether there's a label claim with the EMA than they are in the US, but it's more about using well-validated instruments, the appropriate instruments, and making sure it's methodologically robust and it's published to a specific specification. The value proposition needs to fully capture that quality of survival. Just because you've got 3 months OS benefit, which may or may not be appropriate improvement in clinical effect from a relative or absolute perspective, it's really important to augment that and think about the value proposition much more broadly in the terms of AEs and PROs. Thinking about AEs just from a regulatory perspective is too restrictive. You need to think about analysing, understanding the patient relevance of that AE data, how those AEs are controlled, their treatment requirements, their intensity, their duration, and need to think about that in the context of patient relevance. That needs to be pre-specified within SAPs. We do need to be thinking about value propositions in the context of AEs and PROs at a much broader HTA level and not just a regulatory level as well. So the last area I'm going to focus on today relates to combinations. We've seen a couple of examples in breast cancer where combinations have been assessed by agencies, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide. But there's an impending explosion of expensive combinations that are going to present significant challenges to clinicians in terms of them identifying the appropriate patients for use, but also payers in terms of affordability. There's huge pushback from European payers about the price of single agents already. You can imagine this is going to be an even greater pushback on the concept of combining two expensive agents. There's a whole issue around affordability. I think it's fair to anticipate that the thresholds for evidence for these combinations will be higher than they currently are. It's going to be absolutely critical to be able to identify who will benefit most from these combinations, and we'll need to work hard to define and identify these patients. Again, I think the working assumption should be this is very, very unlikely to be in line with the regulatory label. What are the expectations around the magnitude of effect? Are these expected to be synergistic? Are they expected to be additive? What are some of the issues about contractual relationships, especially if the combinations are based on two products from different manufacturers? And I think from a trial design and investment perspective from a manufacturer, it's important to understand that there are combinations that have a higher probability of being reimbursed compared to others. There will be combinations in certain disease areas, in certain lines of therapy that have significant benefit that agencies will be willing to invest in. However, there will be many different combinations in therapy areas where that combination is just not reimbursable. So it's really critical to be thinking about this much earlier. So given the excitement around this from a scientific perspective, how can manufacturers identify commercially relevant opportunities to combine agents and gain appropriate prices and volume? And the big example we've seen at the minute relates to Perjeta. Interestingly, from a NICE perspective, this was referred to the decision support unit as not cost effective at zero price. So I think there's an important issue there to understand how that assessment goes on. But the concept of additive benefit and how that relates to the pricing opportunity is an important concept to explore there. How do we think about this? Well, I think it's absolutely clear that the early investment decisions in selecting and identifying combinations should be driven by science and market access considerations. We need to anticipate that the evidence threshold will be higher. And what do I mean by that? Well, who is the target patient population? What is the unmet need in that patient population? What is the benefit of a doublet or a triplet compared to conventional treatment options? The quality of survival in this context becomes even more critical than it is today. You're combining on a potentially additional agent with additive adverse events. So how do you show that doesn't have a negative influence on AEs? How do you show that doesn't have a negative or deleterious impact on quality of life? So the whole concept of quality of survival becomes even more important. Obviously, the whole issue of affordability and pricing schemes is going to be a big issue here. Combine your own products if possible. Think about the contractual issues and the nightmare around thinking about combining with another manufacturer's product if that's subject to a risk share scheme or a patient access scheme. That's going to be a minefield to negotiate there. So ideally, you really want to be thinking about combining your own products. That gives you much more commercial flexibility around that. Be realistic about the pricing opportunity. If you're adding on and you've not got additive effect, that bounds your pricing opportunity to the product you've added on to. So be realistic about the pricing opportunity. Think about pricing for combinations as opposed to monotherapies or agents by themselves. So as we've gone through these issues, there's obviously a number that we've not focused on today. What we would like to know from you, though, is what would you like to hear next? We have a series of upcoming webinars, 3 over the next 3 months, and we'd like to get your feedback about how valuable you would see these contents and themes. So the poll is open now for you to vote. I'll just pause there for a minute to allow everybody to vote. Okay, thanks very much for everybody voting there. So I'd just like to summarise before we open for questions. So clearly, the current and emerging market access landscape for oncology agents in the EU is becoming ever more challenging. We understand there's a tension there between delivering trial programs for the US while having to face more complex and stringent evidence requirements in the EU. Multiple examples of products that have not gained commercially relevant access, but hopefully as we've gone through a number of these issues, we've identified that critically evaluating a lot of these technical challenges in an earlier and more strategic manner will help manufacturers make more informed development decisions, better understand the trade-offs between access, price and reimbursement, and ultimately de-risk investment. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to ask my colleague Claire to share some of the questions that have been coming in through this session. So, in your experience, where do manufacturers most often go wrong? Well, that's a good question to start with. I think during the presentation we've highlighted some of those issues, and I think we all recognise and live the challenge that we face of trying to ensure that there's appropriate level of input at an early enough stage of development to not necessarily shape the trial program, but make the organization aware of those trade-offs around the decisions they're making. So I think the key areas where manufacturers most often go wrong is around the choice of comparator, is around thinking too late in regard to a lot of these issues that we've highlighted. And hopefully the webinar has highlighted that I think you can think much more strategically about some of these issues as opposed to it being a very technical, tactical discussion much closer to HTA submission. Lots of people are talking about the importance of real-world evidence. What types of real-world evidence can be used to generate evidence alongside a trial to mitigate some of the challenges you've discussed? Another good question. There's various ways you can go about that. One of the challenges we face, so I'll split that out into pre-launch and post-launch. In terms of pre-launch, a lot of real-world evidence in oncology can be used to, one, understand the treatment landscape and by country to think through the comparator. Two, use of registries to identify natural history. So there's various ways you can go about that, chart reviews, clinician surveys, registry assessments. None of those particularly, all those have different pros and cons, but there's various different sources that you can refer to understand those trade-offs. In the context of coming to market without OS data, I think it's really important to supplement those trials with longer-term follow-ons in your studies and making sure you're able to submit at least immature OS data to the HTAs. You've usually got at least a year from time of regulatory submission through to HTA submission, so that gives you an opportunity to get more complete, albeit immature data. And then there's a whole different work stream required there to understand some of the issues around reassessment, and given that a lot of these reassessments in oncology are based on much shorter reassessment times now, the value of that real-world information is going to be much higher now. You want to be understanding in which patients, what are the factors that have led to treatment decisions, what are some of the outcomes, real-world outcomes, etc., etc. What would be a good strategic market access approach to oncolytics that could be used indefinitely, e.g. immunotherapy? Well, that's a very interesting perspective. So potentially we've got that challenge in CLL with longer term use with some of the newer agents there, and of course some of the countries are set up to look at costs of or price of therapies over a 12-month window, so there's some issues to work through there. I think in the NICE decision around zero, even if this product was given at zero price, it still wouldn't be cost effective. There's an issue there because better outcomes with Perjeta led to longer treatment duration with trastuzumab, so there's a big issue there from a cost effectiveness perspective dealing with that. I think the whole concept then of earlier is better. Can you think about what is the value of intervening earlier in the therapy? What about some of the innovative risk shares, arrangements around that to drive some of that thinking? That's a very, very challenging question, but I think that's going to be one that's going to effectively be governed by price, volume and negotiation with individual countries. We're obviously seeing that in a more contained version at the minute with what's happening with HCV, with a lot of the new agents there, but that's on a shorter treatment duration. So another question relates to patient relevance of particular AEs since the PRO instrument has been selected, and then we're talking about the value of the label claim here. So I think the world from a PRO perspective has moved on very rapidly in the last 2 years in Europe. It's much less about PRO in a label context. It's much more about the application within an HTA context. So would be encouraging people to be thinking about the needs of multiple stakeholders there. Within the context of the FDA, very, very challenging to get a label claim, and you need to critically evaluate the value of that as well in the context of the US market. But from a European market, I think the discussion needs to move on to the HTA relevance and application as opposed to the regulatory perspective on that. Okay, so I don't think we've got time for any more questions. So with that, I will say the webinar is now closed. Thank you very much for your time. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out to us on the emails that have been provided, and there'll be a link put up about with regard to the webinar later on today. Thank you very much for everybody's time and interest.